2018, taps in the city of Cape Town, South Africa, almost ran dry, as major dams across the Western Cape province reached critically low levels. 3 years of below-average rainfall necessitated ever-increasing restrictions on water consumption and required urgent intervention and adaptation on the part of city management, citizens and businesses. The Day Zero campaign, a city communication strategy counting down to the day when the taps would run dry, accompanied the restrictions. These interventions achieved an unprecedented reduction in urban water consumption, though some felt they were implemented too late, as Day Zero grew ever closer. The rain eventually arrived at the end of May, and Day Zero was averted, for the time being, though restrictions remain in place. Climate change predictions indicate an increase in both the frequency and intensity of droughts across much of South Africa. This, coupled with the growing population and rapid urbanization, threaten available water resources. In this regard, South Africa is not unique. The same challenges are present across Africa and indeed much of the developing world. What are some of the lessons we can take from how the Cape Town drought was managed? What have been the barriers and enablers to reducing the impact of the drought on the city? Will the current high volume of water in the dams deflect attention from the urgent need to invest in long-term resilience to avoid more dire situations in the future? Associate Professor Gina Ziervogel is a faculty member at the University of Cape Town Department of Environmental and Geographical Science and is a research chair at the African Climate and Development Initiative. She also sits on the City of Cape Town Section 80 Water Resilience Advisory Committee. In this Connecting the Dots presentation, she shares findings from her current research into lessons learned from the Cape Town drought. This project draws on interviews with 15 government officials involved in managing the drought, and from a series of drought learning dialogue sessions she has run with senior city management.
Really, this was a complex problem. When I look at that list of barriers and enablers, when I look at everything that people have said, there's no single story. There are so many views. Some people go, oh, we collaborated so well. Others go, collaboration was terrible. So it depends on people's personal experiences. It depends on the specific part that people are talking about. And there really are so many different ways of looking at it. And I guess part of the story then is to say, well, how can we learn from that and see those instead of trying to just put this blanket brush over, was it a success or a failure? So in terms of the citywide response and the governance, when I spoke to people from disaster risk management at the city and at the province, they had started to identify the drought in 2015. They were seeing it in the province. They were alerting national government to that. In the city, early on in 2017 and even in 2016. But in 2017, the mayor in May really sort of accelerated attention to the drought, and what she did is she moved responsibility for the drought response to her office. So she got together 4 people, and Craig Kesson, the Chief Resilience Officer, led that, and Gareth, who was going to be here, was one of the people on that team as well. And so this was quite an unusual shift, taking it away from water and sanitation, who'd always had responsibility for water-related issues. And so some people saw that as quite an important shift, and they felt that because it went into the mayor's office, the EDs, the executive directors across the city then became involved in it. And that was really important because it did become a citywide response. The mayor took it on. It really shifted attention to the drought across the city, which was important. But other people felt that taking it away from water and sanitation was difficult. People in water and sanitation felt that some of their responsibilities had been taken away. They had the technical know-how, and people talked about this tension where people who didn't have technical know-how were then making decisions about what should happen. So there was definitely tension around that. The mayor and Craig Kesson fell out in October, November, and it went back to the Water and Sanitation Department, but not before it had this sort of period where the mayor actually was managing it. It people talk about the daily meetings where the mayor met daily with people across the city. At that point in October, November 2017 was also when Resolve Communications came on board to try and increase the reduction in water by households, which was really important. So what we saw happening was early 2017, before the rainy season, we'd had 2 poor years of rainfall. Water and sanitation hoping it would rain again and the dams would be full. The mayor and a team going, it might not rain again, let's put measures in place. So that was really successful in some ways. And then as the winter rains didn't fall as hoped, it was clear that we were in a crisis stage. And so the Water Resilience Task Team, as it came to be known, led by Craig, really focused on augmentation in those early days of taking things forward. They said, we've got to find water. At the end, closer to October, November, it became clear that despite incredible project management and procurement from the city that was at a rate that has never happened before in the city, is very hard to do in cities, and so that was exceptional, yet new water takes a long time to come on board. You don't build yourself out of a drought, and that was what the initial strategy tried to put forward. So there's an interesting overlap of the politics that happened with Patricia and Craig at the time, as well as this international expertise, and a shift started to happen in October where there was less emphasis on the augmentation and more on water demand management. And that is when Resolve came in and they realized that despite the restrictions, despite what they were trying to put in place around demand management, things weren't really happening as they hoped. And so we saw that ramp up November, December, and then we saw January, the mayor making the statement of, you need to reduce water. It's now up to the citizens, which was when the Day Zero thing came in. And I'll talk a bit more about Day Zero just now. And then the last point I've put on there is that in terms of success and governance, for me, what's really exciting coming out of this is that currently, literally, like as we speak, the water strategy is being developed. This is the first water strategy the city's had, and it is not only held in the Water and Sanitation Department. It is a water strategy that is across the city, that as a member of the Section 80 committee, I've been involved in a few workshops around it and had some input to it, is a much more holistic look at water in the city of Cape Town. The other success story is really around water demand management. So water demand management has been really successful in terms of the pressure management zones. And people talk about this a lot, and it is something that the city had implemented over 10 years ago. They'd started putting these water management zones in, and Neil can also add to this discussion later because he'll know more about the technical details. But one of the things that was important, both about the pressure management zones and the water management devices, is they were in before the crisis. So there were institutional arrangements in place, there was an understanding of what they meant, there was technical understanding, and so during the crisis they could scale them up, and that was really an important lesson that they had. The water management devices, I'm sure many of you have heard, were put in place over 10 years ago, mainly trying to address leaks in low-income areas where there's been poor building and a lot of leaks, and so those pressure management devices had gone in to limit households to 350 litres a day. And so again, when the crisis hit, they knew what pressure management devices were, they knew how they implemented them, and they put them into high water using households. For me, this was really exciting as somebody who's interested in equity and what it means. It wasn't just the low income households anymore, it was also high income and often wealthy households who then had these management devices in place saying you cannot use the amount of water you're using. So that was important. And then we really did see a shift in consumption. There have been, there's been awards this year where the city of Cape Town did not interrupt supply, yet we saw this huge drop in how much water was used. So there really was a massive shift. In terms of the lessons, the water management department, so in water and sanitation, there is a water management group with their own leadership, their own resources that was put in place over 10 years ago, and that they feel is really important and doesn't actually happen in many other cities where they have a dedicated group who are focusing on this, so they've got skills in that area. I've talked about the fact that these were in place before the drought, but one of the things that people in this department said is they really did feel that there was collaboration across departments during this time. And one person said it was actually a fantastic time to work here, as we got cooperation from all departments and were able to get things done that we weren't able to before. So they've been trying some of these things. I mean, the green map, the green dot map, for example, they worked with the IT department. They talk about retrofitting city buildings in a way that they hadn't been able to before. So there was a lot of stuff that happened that water management department can't do on their own, but suddenly they got the support and other departments wanted to work with them, and that was really exciting because those relationships are now in place going forward. Relationships are important. And there were some key individuals, and I just wanted to mention two here. And John Roberts is very happy to be mentioned, and he works for the Department of Water and Sanitation, but he's in the regional office, so he's based here in Belleville. And he's worked in this department for 30 years, so he knows people in the field. And the transfer of water from the Aikenhof Dam that happened February, I think, was very much John Roberts' doing, because he knew the Groenland farmers. He had worked with them. They said, we don't want these restrictions. We've got water in our dams. It seems ridiculous. He was like, well, there are restrictions in place. You need to comply with those, or you can cede some water to the city. So he worked out an arrangement there very much based on his personal relationships. And there's a lovely story where he says that the senior people from the city of Cape Town were like, John, do we have a contract? Is it signed? He's like, trust me, I've shook on this. And they're like, no. He's like, we've shook on this, it'll happen. I really think that some of the intermediaries have been really important. And one of the big success stories that came out from the people that I spoke to was really around how businesses came together. So there was a lot of tension and frustration from businesses, and a lot of fallout from day zero that is not the part of the story that I'm talking about, but it's the part of the story where Green Cape had relationships with business before. Green Cape worked very closely with provincial government, and provincial government worked closely with the city of Cape Town, and they started pulling together information. They said at first they couldn't get lists of who the businesses were who were using water, etc., but over time they managed to get this data. They put together information packages, etc., and they started to work really well together. Businesses started to do amazing things. Green Cape was able to help them engage with the city in terms of licenses, etc., and province, and so that was really important. Economic Development Partnership started coming on early this year when it was clear that things were in crisis mode and the city needed to engage with civil society and citizens. Because Day Zero was called off, that kind of went down, and I think that's a really important part that needs to be developed further and wasn't developed enough just because of the timing. And then WWF and the water file, the Water Wednesday files were really important. Citizens appreciated that. They appreciated people who knew what was going on, who could communicate well. And so these kind of intermediaries are really important. The Section 80 committee, I think, is mixed. Some people in the city feel that it was really important that the city was able to have a space to share with people outside of the city. And they said questions came up in a way that questions don't normally come up, and they had to think about that. Myself and some others on the committee feel that it wasn't used sufficiently. I kind of felt I would sit there and they'd just present all this information. They were in crisis mode. There wasn't really a sense of, okay, what do you think? How should we go forward? So moving out of the drought, we have been more engaged in this water strategy, which I think is important, had more kind of engaging meetings, and really this needs to be scaled up in terms of partnerships and how they get input from experts beyond the city, because that was clear that they needed. The politics is tricky, but it really is an important part of the story, in the sense that there was a political agenda going on, there was political infighting, and a whole lot of challenges around that. It also came with an increase in attention to the problem, which was really important. So it brought people together, it brought politicians into the discussion. But there are people who feel that there were political issues driving things at the beginning. One of the interviewees said to me that when politicians realized that things were so serious, they actually stepped back and realized that technical decisions had to be made and experts needed to take over, and that political decisions could no longer rule the day. So that was important, and there are lots of bits around that are difficult to untangle but are really important to the Cape Town context. And then in terms of challenges and governance, the cross-scalar governance issue, vertical integration, was a challenge. So Department of Water and Sanitation, there are examples of them being supportive technically in some ways, but there were a lot of challenges in terms of the city asking for requests previously about water augmentation that took a long time or didn't get funding. DWS was supposed to say whether the city could enforce restrictions. They didn't respond, so the city had to go ahead and do it themselves. And similarly now with them dropping restrictions, they went ahead and said restrictions will be dropped. Water use licenses, water service licenses were really challenging apparently. There was just not a lot of clarity on how these licenses worked. Often the DWS takes 300 days to respond to water service intermediary licenses. Clearly there were not 300 days to wait. So the city got some responsibility to help with that, which was really important. But just a lot of the city was really trying to be flexible and responsive and was finding it really hard to get the support of national to do that. Groundwater really emerged as a challenge, and again in the discussion Christine can talk more about that, but clearly groundwater as a water source was important during the crisis, yet national government is responsible for that. And so finding the way through that was really tricky. When we got to stage 6 restrictions, the city got permission to then ask people to tell people to register their boreholes, and that's important. But there's a lot of questions going forward about how groundwater is managed, what we do about it. It is central to our water resources in the city. There is information at national level and around, but access to that information is often limited, and the regulation around that is a big concern. So it's definitely a message that has come out of the drought that we need to understand how we go forward with groundwater. The Western Cape water supply system, the 6 big dams around the Western Cape that where Cape Town gets most of its water, that I'm sure 2 years ago nobody would have known what that meant. I certainly didn't. Now we see that. We all know exactly what that means. But there really wasn't enough data around what was happening in the water supply system 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the consultants who were supposed to be running the models, there was a 2-year delay in their contract, so there just wasn't data available around some of that. So apparently a lot of decisions were made on intuition and expertise rather than hard data. That has been ramped up now and has been prioritized, but was not in place a year and a half ago. Again, there are questions about the extent to which Department of Water actually enforced restrictions last year and the year before. So this year, as we were approaching day 0, there were concerns as to whether those would be enforced or not. They were enforced this year, which is part of why we didn't have a day 0, but that lack of certainty as to whether those would be enforced was really a concern. And then I think one of the things that has been a big learning has been the lack of the city's ability to see the catchment as a whole before the crisis. And now there's just so much more awareness of that, what it means, whether it's alien clearing, whether it's how people work together, whether it's all parts of it. There really is a sense that we need to understand that, and we didn't get it right before. Communication was a big challenge. It's something that I feel was very much a problem and a challenge, but there also was a lot of good work that went on around communications. So there was incredible material developed. People understood what 50 litres was in a way that they never had before, 87 litres. We knew where our so there was a lot going on. We were being taught a lot. We shared a lot of information, but my feeling is that in 2017, the city was trying to manage it themselves. They were like, we've got this under control, and so they didn't want to share a lot of data. There also wasn't a lot of data necessarily to share. And so in the beginning of 2018, we really saw the shift. The water outlook that started being published was a really important point when people could actually get numbers and figures and understand what was going on at last. The water dashboard people have used a lot. Even things like the green dot map, okay, let's share that information. And that really shifted this year, but I think was too slow in coming. People wanted to know a lot earlier what was going on. So there was some really good communication, but there was also some poor communication. And because of the poor communication and because of a history of mistrust from citizens of the city, there were also a lot of groups who were critical of the city. Day Zero is a political attack on the people, says Water Crisis Coalition. I feel that there's a difficult space for the city to say what they're doing. So they issue these press releases, and not everybody looks at press releases. Then the journalists coming with their story. There weren't a lot of sort of impartial communicators as to what the city was doing. So looking forward, what do we need to do in terms of building resilience? Leadership. There was leadership in some areas and a lack of leadership in others. This really needed strong leadership because this was a crisis. Some of the interviewees also talked about the fact that it needed national leadership. It needed ministers to talk about this. If you want people to shift to reusing water, it needs to be seen as okay from people at various levels. Flexibility was a really important point. Within the city, there were definitely areas that were very flexible, responded in ways that they hadn't before, tried to be adaptive in that way. But there were also other areas where it was very hard to be flexible. There were some stories about partnerships that were proposed that really would have helped in the pods, for example, the point of distributions where businesses were willing to come in, and it was just too complicated. In terms of city being able to receive donations, complicated. There's a story about Province who had to send it to NGOs to receive water because it's just too complicated to get bottles of water into our government system if they donate it, and you just need to give them to gift to the givers who can then go and give them to somebody else. Collaboration. Where there was collaboration, this was critical and important, but there was not enough collaboration. Going forward, we need to pay attention to how we build partnerships, how we build relationships, how we work across sectors and silos. Government is not set up to do that. And so there are avenues where it's happening, but more needs to happen. I feel that there wasn't enough collaboration with the academic sector. I'd interview people who had been Googling what's happening in California, and I'd be like, well, they're experts at UCT. Can we please pass you on to some of these people? Or other people who have been doing this for years, could you maybe ask them? But they didn't, because these new people came in who had never worked in the water sector, they didn't even know who these people were. And so that was part of the challenge of having a different group of people trying to lead this. Sustainable finance, I haven't chatted about much, but it's a real big issue. So water tariffs are supposed to cover the cost of water. They're not doing that already. We need to put water tariffs up. That's a problem. The city did not communicate that well. I think it's good that we've gone to a water tariff where we've got a fixed charge. It could be more progressive. We could go to a rates-based model where actually it's based on rates that then people who have higher value properties are paying more. But there are a lot of questions around this. There are a lot of questions around alternative models of financing. Private public partnerships are being considered. Also alternative financing models, disaster management funds, catastrophe bonds, and a lot happening in this field, which is good. The questions are being asked to explore options that weren't asked before. There really needs to be an increase in adaptive management and learning. This is not something the city is necessarily good at. It's not something governments are good at. They don't have the space and support for learning, being flexible, having those spaces. People are used to doing their jobs, delivering on the targets that they've got, not how well have you engaged with others, brought in others to think about new ways of working, which unfortunately means that there is sometimes not a lot of innovation and experimentation because there's a need to be safe. So in some areas we've seen a lot of innovation and experimentation, in other areas not. And then a systems perspective. There really needs to be a broader systems perspective of understanding the catchment, understanding people, diverse perspectives, how water is valued and used across the system in a way that wasn't really appreciated before. And so as one of the interviewees said, we need to move from building resilient infrastructure to building a resilient system. And so the last slide is just some stuff that I gathered from people. Because this was for a city support program, I was asking them, what type of support could you as a city benefit from if you were going to have further development? And so they said they really want guidance on what a water-wise city looks like. So in the water strategy, this is coming through, but I think it'll be really important that people feed into this, because when I pushed them last week at the Section 80 meeting, or the week before, said, what's your definition of water resilience? They kind of ummed and ahed, and Kevin was like there, luckily, to say, well, you are using WONG, so that's good. But they don't really understand that. And so for other cities in South Africa, do they need to go through all of this again, or can we develop some kind of guidance document on what a water-wise city in South Africa looks like, if you're coastal or inland, and some of the principles, so that it's easy for other municipalities or cities to access this? There was a sense from quite a few interviewees that they need more support on how to integrate climate change into planning. It's not something that is easily done. It's challenging for a number of reasons, and more support is needed on this. There was a big question coming up around actually how politicians and technical officials engage, and that we don't do it very well. And the drought showed this. There were politicians who didn't really understand the nature of the challenge. There are technical officials who give apparently long PowerPoint presentations that are really not what politicians are going to sit through and absorb. So both groups need to get better at working together, and actually a lot of decisions are made by politicians, so we need to make sure that they understand some of the technical issues at hand. And then we need to think more about financing disasters and what this means, especially these slow onset ones. Our Disaster Management Act, if you are declared a disaster, and when the 3 provinces declared a disaster, they then got there was a national disaster in South Africa, and it's the only national disaster South Africa's ever had. So that was interesting. You then get funding, but you have to use that funding within 3 months because it's a disaster. And of course, droughts and augmentation and many of the responses are much longer than that. And so it's hard to actually finance disasters given the current model that we have. And so then my last slide is actually for the discussion, so I'm not going to talk about it, but we want to come back to it in the discussion. One of the other areas that needs more attention, and Johanna can hopefully also speak to the work they're doing here, is understanding behavior change. The city does not really understand behavior change. The province has got a group that's looking at behavior change, which is great, but there aren't really experts within the city. So in water demand management, Johanna and Martine and people worked with them to do a lot of work on this. But more work is done and more capacity is needed within the city to understand this. So when we have the discussion, we would like to get you to answer a question using the Mentimeter, because it'll help us to think more about one of the responses to the crisis from your perspective that we'd like to open up in the discussion. So thank you very much.